Welcome to Dread Alert, where we cover horror across all forms of media. Today, we are ranking our all-time top 5 final girls.
I'm very excited for this. We have already done our top 5 all-time slashers. If you haven't watched that video, check it out.
Before we dive in, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, it really helps us out, and leave your list in the comments below. I bet it's going to look a lot different than the list we're about to give you.
Let's kick things off with number 5.
My number 5 is Nika from the Child's Play series. A late addition to the series, I know, but I think Fiona Dourif gives a heck of a performance across Curse and Cult of Chucky, not to mention the great work she's done in the Chucky TV series. I think the thing that really makes Fiona stand out and Nika stand out is when she crosses over into Chucky Fiona territory, where she's actually playing Charles Lee Ray, who was played by her father, Brad Dourif, and you look at this, you see her doing one heck of an impression of her father as Chucky at the end of Cult of Chucky and through the TV series. I think it's commendable acting, but Nika also is a standout character. She's tough, and I think with her disability, she's more vulnerable, you relate to her more, and as an audience member, we relate to the final girl. She's in peril, we feel like we're in peril, and putting her in a wheelchair makes us feel a bit more at risk when things start to break loose.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Nika is an interesting case because, like you said, she's got that disability. But I also don't feel like that ever holds Nika back
Absolutely
in
not.
any way, shape, or form. So I just think that it's a very interesting take on the final girl and something that Don Mancini is always trying to innovate and reinvent what the Chucky franchise really is all about.
And I think Don Mancini does this really respectfully with Nika. I, again, don't think it holds her back in any way. I think she's tough as nails, and I think you have to be to survive Chucky. Chucky's brutal. And it ties in interestingly with her backstory in Curse of Chucky. I think there's just a lot to love about the character. And it's interesting, I think you mentioned this in our Slashers video, that Chucky typically has a final boy.
Yeah.
At least across the first 3 Child's Play movies. So giving Chucky a true final girl and carrying her throughout 2 movies and 3 seasons of TV really elevated the series for me. A series that's not afraid to grow and change with the times. What about your number 5?
My number 5 is going to be Crystal from The Hunt. So The Hunt is a very interesting movie. I feel like it's a little underrated. It came out in 2020, right at the height of everything that was going on in the world. But Crystal is a very tough broad. Yeah. She is a former Army vet. And I feel like from the second that we meet her, she is already plotting her next move.
Yeah.
And she is trying to figure out and solve her own problems to hell with everybody else. And I love a really tough final girl, and I feel like she really ticks that box. Plus, that final fight scene that she has is so awesome to watch. It's so well choreographed, and you can't go wrong with Betty Gilpin's acting in that movie.
And I recall The Hunt, at least in the early release of the trailers, caused a lot of political stir and a lot of drama. And I think if you haven't seen the movie because of that, you're missing out. I don't think that the drama surrounding the movie was the movie at all. I think the movie is something completely different than all of the drama around it. And I will say, I like a tough final girl, but I also like a smart final girl. And I think she is absolutely cunning and clever and not afraid to play people off of each other to get what she wants and call people's bluff to get what she wants.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people underestimate her smarts. And I think that that is where she really shines, Absolutely. Is that people are constantly underestimating her.
Moving on to number 4. This is going to be a controversial pick, I think, because some of these movies aren't true horror. I'm going with Ellen Ripley from the Alien franchise. And I'm going to bracket this like I did with Zombie Jason. Ellen Ripley in Alien, Aliens, and Alien 3. The Ellen Ripley we see in Alien Resurrection isn't quite Ellen Ripley, and I don't think that movie has the legs to support being on this list. But Ellen Ripley in Alien specifically, why didn't we just listen to her? Why didn't we just listen to Ripley? I feel like listen to Ripley needs to be tattooed on my body somewhere. She called the whole thing. If we would have just listened to Ripley, none of this would have happened. And the tenderness she shows in Aliens And I think the self-sacrifice she shows in Alien 3, outside of the smarts, outside of the toughness, outside of that mech suit at the end of Aliens, we have a final girl who has a lot of heart. In Aliens, we see that mothering side of her with Newt, and even with Jonesy the cat, we get to see nurturing aspects to her as well. So she's not just tough. She's not just smart. She's also nurturing and caring and a completely well-rounded character. Even if some of the later movies lean into action and sci-fi, I'm still going with Alien as a true slasher movie.
I was going to riot if you didn't bring Jonesy up, because really the true star of that movie. But I do think that Sigourney Weaver really brings such a tenderness, like you mentioned, but also somebody who is willing to do whatever it takes. And that is why I think Ripley is a character that resonates with a lot of people across the spectrum. I do agree that some people may say, well, it's kind of sci-fi, but I think that we have so many subgenres of horror these days that I think that Alien fits right in with that.
I think Alien bumps right up against the first Alien. I think it bumps right up against the slasher movie. You may not have those slasher themes of vengeance, but we do have this force and this counterforce, and Ripley is the most appropriate counterforce that we get across the entire series. Alien versus Predator, Alien Resurrection, Prometheus, Alien Covenant. We don't have a counterbalance to these xenomorphs like Ripley, and I think the series is worse off for it. So what about your number 4?
My number 4 is going to be Margot from The Menu. This is a horror comedy, and this may not be a traditional pick, so to speak, but I think that Margot may be the only one that survived this movie and thus makes her a final girl.
I'm not sure she survives. Who's to say that burger isn't poisoned? I'm not 100% sold that everybody's on the up and up at the end of that film.
Well, I think that that's fair, but I do think that she found a way to get herself out of that situation in a very clever and conniving way. And I think that that is why she has to rank on this list. Plus, Anya Taylor-Joy is literally a joy to watch on screen. And having her go up against Ralph Fiennes and the battle between them, but not a traditional battle, a battle of wits and a battle of fortitude.
I don't know that he's not a slasher. He's definitely motivated by a sense of injustice. Interestingly enough, I think it's her background in sex work that gets her out of this, because she can read people's emotions and read people's needs, and that really is an empowering message.
Yeah, she definitely did. She saw that picture and she knew intuitively exactly what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that that is why she has to rank on my list.
I love the choice. Moving on to number 3. I'm going with a classic here. Nancy from the Nightmare franchise. First and foremost, Nancy never appears in a Nightmare movie that is not one of the best Nightmare movies. In a franchise that has some clunkers, Nancy's in the good ones. Nightmare on Elm Street is a classic film, and I love the aspect of no one believing Nancy. It sort of brings the child's play aspect of nobody believing Andy in. That it's a really compelling device, and the fact that she has to solve this problem on her own while all of her friends are dying, and that she figures out a way to bring Freddy out of the dream world to end it, is huge. Moving on to Nightmare 3, when she's the mentor figure, I love that side of Nancy. And I'm also going to add an asterisk on this one. Heather is included in my ranking here. In Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Heather Langenkamp coming in and protecting her family and stepping back into the shoes of Nancy to fight this dream demon in the guise of Freddy Krueger. I love this movie. I know it might be an underrated pick. I love this movie. It was one of the first horror movies I got to see back to front, not edited for TV. It was right around the time just before Scream came out in theaters. I love this movie. I think the meta nature of it is outstanding, and I think the performance by Heather Langenkamp is outstanding as well. Heather and Nancy are my number 3 pick.
I would agree that Nancy makes the Nightmare films better overall. I would also agree that some of my favorite Nightmare movies are the original Dream Warriors and New Nightmare. So I have to really agree with you there. Heather Langenkamp and Nancy elevate the Nightmare series as a whole. My number 3 is going to be Grace from Ready or Not. This movie is so much fun. I think that Grace is also a really badass final girl. She comes from a sort of broken childhood. She is longing for family and she thinks she's found it, and she definitely has not. She sort of knows intuitively, I think, how to get herself out of this situation and doing it in a very badass way. Ultimately, she wins pretty hard at the end.
A couple of things struck me about this film. I feel like she survives this film. I feel like she takes her fate into her own hands, but I feel like she survives it. I was shocked at how few people she kills. Not that I want to see a final girl with a giant body count, but a lot of things happen to the people around her that she's not necessarily responsible for. There are some violent things that she does, and she definitely takes a life or two in this movie, but I was surprised that there were so many people standing at the climax.
Yeah, I would agree with that. She has really weakened them, though, in terms of their spirits. And I think that that is why she is landing where she does on my list. She really has broken these people that think that they are unbreakable.
We slept on this movie for way too long.
We did.
It's a great film. I had a blast watching it. I love the tone. I love the vibes. I love the performances. I was just surprised that the violence was so backloaded into the third act.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely backloaded. There are some moments where she uses a very creative way to injure someone. That ingenuity is why she lands where she does on this list.
She's crafty. She's crafty for sure.
What about your number 2?
My number 2, and it pains me to do this, I thought about this list long and hard before I committed to it. It's Laurie Strode. I want Laurie so badly to be number 1 on this list. Laurie is the entire package. Laurie has the awareness that keeps her alive. Laurie has the smarts that keep her alive. Laurie has the toughness that keeps her alive. But what really holds Laurie back for me is that her main go in Halloween and Halloween 2, I feel like she just hadn't got the hang of being a final girl as a character. She drops the knife. She drops the knitting needle. She drops the knife again. She is drugged up for most of Halloween 2. And it's not until H2O that we see badass Laurie. It's not until 2018 that we see severely broken, yet badass Laurie. And when we look at kills, she's laid up again. And when we look at ends, she's made peace with everything. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm going out on another limb right now and saying Halloween Ends is a fine film. At me all day on this one. I want to talk about it. But Laurie Strode, in her major outings, where she is the final girl, she's the centerpiece, there's no competing character for that final girl title, she still hasn't gotten the hang of it. And that's because I think the genre as a whole hadn't gotten the hang of it yet. It didn't understand the formula it was discovering. That said, Laurie Strode is my number 2, and it breaks my heart to say it.
My number 2 is also Laurie Strode. So we are agreeing on that right now. I agree with a lot of what you have said about her kind of fumbling the bag a little bit, and that's why she's placed a little bit lower. But I think that the interesting thing about Laurie is that we get her across multiple timelines just based on how the Halloween franchise is laid out at this point.
I love it so much.
Right? In doing that, we do see Laurie go after Michael at various points in her life. We see Laurie go after Michael as a teenager. Then we see Laurie go after Michael as a mother. And then we see Laurie go after Michael as a grandmother. And I think that there is something to say about seeing Laurie at those different aspects of her life and how she reacts and responds to Michael in those moments. And we don't get that with any other final girl on this list.
Hopefully we get to see that with another final girl that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But before we get into that, it's time for honorable mentions. Sara, Who is your first honorable mention?
My first honorable mention is going to be Sienna from the Terrifier franchise.
Solid choice.
I am very excited to see what Sienna is going to do in Terrifier 3. The reason that she is in my honorable mentions right now is while she really came out swinging in Terrifier 2, I just didn't quite see everything that I wanted to see from her. I feel like art still sort of stole the show in Terrifier 2. I'm thinking of one scene in particular that everybody talks about in Terrifier 2. So I feel like we need to have a scene where Sienna is really rising to that similar occasion for me to be able to rank her a little bit higher on this list.
Yeah, honestly, that's the only reason she didn't make my list, is that there's just not enough body of work. She did take a beating in that film.
She did.
The performance was also really strong, but again, there's just not enough for me to give her that spot.
What about your first?
My first honorable mention is Sara from The Descent. Not a traditional slasher film, more of a monster movie and more of a character study, but you can't overlook the fact that Sara has lost literally everything and then lost even more on top of it in this chain of trauma that she goes through. The one scene where she falls into that giant pit of blood and emerges as a totally new woman. She honestly looks different. Her eyes are just bananas and she's drenched in blood and she comes out born again as our final girl. And there is nothing more badass than that moment and her taking on all of those crawlers, cave dwellers, whatever the monsters are. We're also going to talk about the fact that we are talking about the European ending to The Descent, and we don't really talk much about The Descent 2 in our household.
No, we do not. But you love that movie in particular. When she falls into that pit, it really is like she is birthing her final girl status in that moment. That is really what makes her very compelling. I truly enjoy watching her go through that trauma. Like you said, it's more of a character study than anything else.
It's time for our number one all-time final girl, and we have the same number one all-time final girl, so we can kind of tackle this together. It's
Sidney Prescott from the Scream franchise.
Sidney Prescott. What I like about Sidney is that from the moment trouble starts, she's on her computer reaching out to 911. She's not afraid to call in help from her friends when she needs it, and that really strengthens her. Although Sidney has a whole canon of horror to draw from, since Scream is a meta horror film, she literally can look up to Laurie Strode. Laurie Strode was writing the book, Sidney was reading it. She calls upon all of these tropes and tries her best to not make those same mistakes, even if she's running up the stairs when 5 minutes before she was criticizing women for doing that same thing.
Yeah, I think that Sidney is very smart. She is very capable of handling herself. And I think what really sets her apart from like a Laurie Strode is that we have Sidney consistently across a timeline, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have any sort of weird jumps in time or jumps in the timeline canon. We have Sidney across all of these Scream movies.
And while I don't think Scream 6 suffered tremendously from Sidney's absence, I do miss checking in with her because she's distinctly different. She has grown as a character across all the entries she's appeared in. Maybe not Scream 1 to 2, I mean she's in college now, but Scream 3, she's done with this nonsense. In Scream 4, she gets to mentor a little bit. In Scream 5, she comes back completely ready to fight. Mm-hmm. And we see a completely different badass Sidney. I wonder who she would have been in Scream 6, and I'm greatly looking forward to a Sidney-centric Scream 7.
It is something to note that in Scream 5, Sidney is now a mother. And I think that that fundamentally sort of changes you. It changed Laurie, and like I mentioned before, seeing Laurie even as a grandmother, that sort of just fundamentally changes who you are as a person and how you react in fight or flight situations.
All right, that wraps up our all-time top 5 final girls. Thanks so much for watching. If you want more ranking content from us, you can watch our all-time top 5 slashers video in the card below. And until next time,
stay spooky, my friends.